It's been a while since the last in-depth development update for Revan's Revenge, so in this video I'll be going over where everything stands for the mod, and what to expect in the first release. To do this, we'll be breaking down everything into four main categories: units, heroes, galactic maps, and then government mechanics and narrative content together. First we have the units. Each of the rosters for the three different factions have received their own breakdown video in the past for their primary ground and space units, where we had generally 10 ground and 5 space units per roster for the Sith, Republic, and Mandalorians, all of whom will be fully playable in the first release. Of those roughly 45 units, only a couple Sith ground units are still outstanding, along with a texture for the Republic tank droid. We've been hoping to expand that to 7 or 8 units per faction in space, which we've been able to nearly complete as well. For the Republic, this has meant the addition of the Coruscant Courier, which is awaiting a texture, and a smaller version of the Inexpugnable, which we're calling the Swiftsure variant, basing it more directly on the comic scaling. Considering how much less source material there is to work off of compared to Fall of the Republic and Thrawn's Revenge, we're often going to be taking advantage of major discrepancies between how certain ships are portrayed to make different variants of them. For the Sith, we've added the Korriban Patrol Corvette and the Sith Heavy Carrier, both of which just need their coding finished after their stats are finalized. For the Mandalorians, even though they already had 7 units, because 2 of those are battlecruisers, we're still hoping to add a dungeon ship type. This is among the lowest priority things to do though. Beyond the core ground and space set, there are of course fighters, infantry, and unique ships like the Ebon Hawk. While infantry have a lot of room to be expanded based on KOTOR and other content, and that's something we're hoping to make good use of in the future, we're sticking to a couple basic types in the first release, all of which are done for all 3 factions. We have some assets made for additional types like the Kasai and Masasi for the Sith, which may or may not make the cut for the first release, along with a small handful of other ground units for most factions. Generally though, we are trying to err on the side of not expanding the scope too much before initial release. On the fighter side, the Republic's primary fighters are all finished, being the Auric, Chayla, and Republic bombers. We do hope to make a new Auric fighter model before the first release, as the one being used is a holdover from the original KOTOR mod, Ages of Star Wars, which several of our developers, including myself, worked on almost 2 decades ago. The Mandalorian fighter roster is composed of the similarly finished Devob and 2 Basilisk types. The Sith are nearly done, though a couple of their fighters still need coding. Their primary 3 are going to be the Sith Interceptor from Knights of the Old Republic, the Chaos Fighter, and a bomber based on concept art. While they also have the potential to get the Krath Bomber, Light Bomber, and Interceptor, which have assets made, but they're not currently coded. They may be held for a second release. The Ebon Hawk is the only unique unit currently, and its asset and code are finished. It does have a slightly harder job awaiting where we need to plug it into a few different places given its different owners and different periods. Overall though, ground is largely in good shape, and the biggest thing with space are some rig adjustments to account for stats that have been set up or changed since the original rigs were made, finalizing some stats for newer units, and then figuring out what system changes need to be made to account for differences in scaling between this mod and our other 2, especially when it comes to the number of fighters and their impact on a battle. Overall, it should mean we're able to use proportionally fewer fighters and bombers on the field at any given time for a similar impact, and fewer projectiles, all of which should also improve performance. Heroes are a slightly trickier subject, since character models are among the hardest things to make, which is the biggest limiting factor for an era that is so heavily based on character-heavy RPG content. We still have a good chunk of assets done, either from our more recent work like Mandalore the Ultimate, or held over from Ages of Star Wars, where we're using the Revan, Malak, Nihilus, HK, Bastila, and Karth models from. But this may be an area where the first few releases we're using a few placeholder assets for characters who are important for balance or specific mechanics, or even some narrative reasons, but don't quite have a finished asset yet. There are a couple, like Darth Sion, who we're hoping to complete dedicated assets for before the release. Each faction has a reasonable set of space heroes already set up, and those are a lot easier since they're typically in ship models we already have, and we do plan to use the command staff system from Fall of the Republic and Thrawn's Revenge for the Republic here, with a staff for fleet commanders and one for Jedi. The way we're going to be specifically handling the KOTOR and KOTOR 2 party members will typically vary from character to character, but our hope is to have as many of them as possible present in some form as early as we can, even Disciple if we have to. The exact set of heroes and where each will be used will probably be one of the things most in flux as we approach release, but as it stands we have a relatively good baseline to make the mod at least playable, which is the primary goal of the initial release, and then we'll be using the next couple releases to expand the content more. In our third category, galactic maps, we're hoping to include a few basic ones. First are the progressive maps of different sizes, with different selectable starting eras. Initially, the selectable starting eras will probably be early Mandalorian Wars, late Mandalorian Wars, Jedi Civil War, so KOTOR 1, and KOTOR 2. The second set of maps will be an Infinity's version of those progressive maps, which adjust more of the territory to keep the Sith, Republic, and Mandalorians on a more even footing, since usually only one of the Sith or Mandalorians are particularly strong at any given time otherwise. Then there will be a few historical maps, first being a Mandalorian Wars map with 2 selectable eras, one later on in the war meant for an even fight, and one which is meant as more of a challenge run for the Mandalorians starting earlier on. I also plan on having a map finished for covering the Jedi Civil War, although doing a map directly for KOTOR 2 is less likely for this first release, especially given there are other characters we still need to finish that are pretty important for that period. Finally, there will be a from the ground up map, or a single planet start map, available for all factions. The maps overall are fairly underdeveloped currently. Several have gone through a couple iterations, but the main goal has been deciding which planets are needed and adding those to the mod before doing anything too final for the maps. Over the next little while, I will be working on finalizing at least a couple of them as we solidify what we want to cover, which brings us to the fourth and final point, government mechanics and narrative events. With a smaller, more limited roster in the mod than our other projects, we do still want to make sure each faction has some kind of basic government mechanic. For the Republic, this means the command staff, though they'll hopefully get something else. For the Mandalorians, we're trying out a tactical faction mechanic, which they'll probably end up sharing with the Avethans in Thrawn's Revenge. The Sith's first mechanic is a mix of factional mechanic for them and a narrative storyline tied to the Starforge, though in practice it's more of an active concern for the other factions than for them. These are pretty fully planned out, but right now focus is more on implementing the Hutt government mechanics in the other 2 mods, and then we'll be shifting back to these mechanics. They'll be getting a full video covering them once they're a bit further along in production. The Starforge asset itself, though, was recently finished. All of this means at least one major story mission should be present for all 3 factions, but we'll hopefully have a couple more set up as well. Each faction will also have access to the intervention missions that we've reintroduced over the last couple releases of Fall of the Republic, which should similarly help with feelings of progression, although reward pools will take a while before they're quite as diverse. Hopefully that gives you a decent sense of what to expect with the mod and where we stand. There's still a fair chunk left to do, but a lot of focus on the team has started shifting more in this direction as we've finished 1.3 and 3.3 of Thrawn's Revenge and Fall of the Republic. If you want to follow development as it happens, make sure to subscribe here or to check out the Discord server linked in the description.